Hi, my name is Kim Mutcherson, co-dean of Rutgers Law School in Camden, and this is The Power of Attorney. I am extremely excited today to have with us one of our clinical faculty, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
My name is Joanne Gottesman, and I direct the Immigrant Justice Clinic here at Rutgers Law School in the Camden location.
Fantastic. I'm extremely excited, obviously, to talk to you about the work that you do. This is a time when immigration is on lots of people's minds for a whole range of different reasons. But I want to go backwards a little bit because one of the things that's really fun to talk to people about is how they ended up where they are now. Everyone's going to care that you and I went to the same law school, so I will put that out there first.
Right.
Not only did we go to the same law school, we had the same public interest fellowship after we graduated from law school. So you have clearly simply been following in my footsteps, which
for
is
my
acceptable.
Entire life.
Yes.
Because I do recall that you were there when I went in for my interview for the fellowship. You were there as the experienced fellow to calm our nerves.
Exactly. So there you go. So talk to me a little bit about why you wanted to be a lawyer. Why was this the particular career choice?
Well, actually, I was a little bit resistant at first. So I was out of out of college for 5 years before I decided to go to law school. I spent a lot of that time in China and doing work related to China. And in fact, I had worked at the Center for Chinese Legal Studies at Columbia for 2 years. And it would have been natural, right, to go to law school right from there. But
Right.
I said to myself, no, I have to make sure. I don't know if this is the right thing to do. It's a big decision. And so first I heard of an opportunity at ABC News in Beijing. And so I went off back to China again, and I worked at ABC for 2 years. And I think it was there that I really decided that I wanted to go to law school. I thought, well, maybe journalism was something I could do. But it was really tricky being a journalist in China. And I felt like some of the people who we talked to were going to get in trouble for talking to us. And I felt like I wanted to try to maybe be on the side of figuring out how to protect people's rights. And not that the journalists weren't. In fact, they were doing amazing work uncovering the problems, but it was so limited. And I was working in television, and it was just so superficial what we were able to do. And so I felt like really to dig deep, maybe it was time to reconsider that thought. And so that's why I came back and I went to law school thinking that I was going to do international human rights work. And then I did the Human Rights Fellowship at Columbia my first summer and was actually in Hong Kong working with the Hong Kong Democratic Party the summer before the transition to Chinese control. And it was fascinating and it was amazing, but it felt a little bit distant because I was writing reports, doing a lot of written work, but not working with people. And it was really through clinic and my internships in law school that I realized that what I personally thrive on is individual client representation.
So I'm one of those people, you probably know this, I'm one of those people who always tells students you must do a clinic while you're in law school. And for me, the clinic that I did in law school was incredibly formative.
So I actually wanted to ask you about that because I think you did the prisoners and families.
I did.
Which is what I did as well.
Yep.
So, but I don't think I ever really heard about your experience. Am I allowed to flip the chairs? Because I mean, my experience in that clinic was really transformative, but I don't think I really know the story of what your experience was like.
Sure.
Because I know we both took the same clinic, but in different, I took it as a 3L.
Mm-hmm. I also took it as a 3L,
Right.
And I took it, again, when it was prisoners and families, as opposed to what it had been before, which was really just focused on children and families. Right. It's an experience that honestly still shapes me and how I think about the world. And so the Prisoners and Families Clinic, when we did it, was a clinic that basically provided free legal services to women who were incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is probably still is the only maximum security facility for women in New York State. And so we did a few things. One was that we went up to Bedford Hills and we did sort of informational and educational programs for the women who were there about sort of their rights. And then we also would represent people who had cases that were ongoing. And so the woman who I represented with my partner, in retrospect, I think back on this a lot now that I'm a parent. And she was a person who was in the midst of a termination of parental rights, a TPR. And she was maybe in her mid-20s, right? Relatively young. She had a child who was a toddler. She was incarcerated, and she was going to stay in prison for an extended period of time. And so the state's position was, obviously, you can't parent because you're in prison. And so, we went and we met her and we did intake and, we talked through her whole story. And ultimately, what we came to after talking to her and looking at all the records from the Child Welfare Agency was we weren't going to win, right? I mean, she was just in a position where it was very clear to us and to our supervisor that this was not a case where we were going to be able to actually maintain her parental rights. And what I remember the most is when we went to visit her at Bedford Hills and said, we think you're going to lose. And again, I think about that as a parent, like what that moment must be like. And particularly because, I'm there with my partner. We're in our 20s. Neither one of us has had the life experiences that she was a young Latina woman, has had. And we're telling her they're going to take your kid and you're probably never going to see her again. And that's just a really striking experience to have. And it, of course, made me think about our criminal justice system and how deeply flawed it is, about our child welfare system and how deeply flawed it is, about our inability to provide so many people with the kinds of services that they need in order to be able to live the kinds of lives that we say we want them to be able to live. And so I think it's not a coincidence that I ended up doing sort of family law. It's kind of thinking about those issues.
And you can think about those systemic issues in a lot of different ways, but it's really powerful to think about them from inside the walls of a prison with a person sitting across from you who is going through that experience.
Absolutely.
And I suspect, did you have Lori or Philip?
I had Lori.
Okay, yeah, I had Philip, but they were both just amazing professors to kind of guide us through those experiences and to process what it all meant. Yeah, so for me, I didn't have a termination of parental rights case. I had a denial of parole case. And so my client had killed her abuser and had been sentenced to a long prison term because of that. And it had been an incredibly abusive relationship. And she was actually doing incredibly well, had gotten a, associate's degree in prison and was in a special program where she could leave prison to work. I mean, it was back in the day where that was possible in New York. And so my partner and I had a oral argument in front of a judge about the denial. And I remember because the judge walked in with a stack of law books, she clearly was prepared. She had, bookmarked the books, where the cases we had cited were. And she said, I just want you to know that I'm planning on reserving decision. I'm not going to, issue my decision today. And then we argued, and she issued a decision. She ended up issuing a decision from the bench and granting our client parole. And it was just tremendous, and my client was there, and she cried, and we cried, and, the attorneys in the courtroom, came up to us. And I think also I was not a confident law student, but I ended up really having a very active role at this oral argument and having the sense of wow, we made a difference that day. And of course, Philip said to me, he's like, afterwards, I remember he came up to me and he's like, I just hope you realize that you're not going to have days like this very often. Don't think that this is what being a lawyer is, because this is actually one of those rare magical days. And it just happened to be for you as a third-year law student.
Right.
And I ended up taking the case and continuing with it after graduation because it went to the appellate division. And we lost at the appellate division. And it was also this lesson in the legal system because literally we lost, but it had taken so long, the process, that she was up for her next parole hearing a month later. And so she ended up getting parole even though we lost. But it was just this amazing thing of how the system works, the delays, and what process means, for people. And it could have been mooted if it had taken even longer. And it was just all in all a phenomenal experience. And so I think at that time there was probably a little glimmer in my head like, Philip has a really amazing job. He gets to do this with students and represent clients. And he had such a relationship with, clearly he had been behind the scenes working with our client for years, and we were just coming in at one little piece of her story. So I think for me, not having thought that I would really do litigation, I don't know what I thought doing international human rights work was, but I realized that it was both the amazing thing of developing a relationship with this client and then also realizing that, quiet people can go to court and they can argue, and there are all sorts of people who can be lawyers. And I don't know about you, but I also remember my beginning at Columbia, they had us do the Myers-Briggs personality test.
Yeah.
And so I did it, and I was off in this little corner, in a personality type that was not the one of most of my classmates.
Yeah.
And I remember the visual of seeing my little dot up there in this lonely corner and thinking, what the hell have I just gotten myself into?
Right.
But I think by the end of it, I was like, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Yeah. It takes all kinds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you went to law school basically with an understanding that you were going to do public interest law of some type.
Right.
You had the great experience in the Prisoners and Families Clinic. You got the Kirkland Ellis Fellowship. And who was your host for your fellowship?
So my host for my fellowship was the Legal Aid Society of New York and the Immigration Unit. And actually, I had done an externship with them during law school. So that was where I come in with this complementary notion of the benefits of clinic and the benefits of externship, because I had been there in my second year. There was an immigration externship that Professor Jerry Newman supervised, and there were about 6 or 8 of us who went out to different placements. And so I was at the Legal Aid Society, and that was in the spring of '97, which was when the last major immigration reform was being implemented. So I literally saw in my externship, it went into effect April 1st. It was like one day the lawyers were representing clients in immigration court. The next day, clients had been barred from relief, and so I was able to see that transformation in my externship from a front row seat. And so developing those professional relationships at Legal Aid, I reached out to them about sponsoring me. And the other transformation that happened for me during that externship was I wanted to do immigration because I thought, I'm interested in international human rights. People said asylum work is a way that you can, marry those interests. And then I ended up at a placement because, of course, I didn't really know what I was doing, that focused a little bit on asylum, but mostly on representing people with criminal convictions in removal proceedings. And I discovered that I liked statutes and the statutory analysis that went into doing criminal immigration defense. And so, then I ended up doing a fellowship that was related to working with kids and first-time offenders and youthful offenders in their deportation cases. And Legal Aid was my sponsor, and I ended up sort of going back to where I had externed.
Right. That's fantastic. That's also how I ended up where I did my Kirkland Ellis Fellowship. It was a place where I had externed. So let's talk about what you do now here at Rutgers. So you followed in the footsteps of Philip, and you became a clinical faculty member, and you run our immigrant justice clinic here at Rutgers Law School on the Camden campus. So how about first you just tell folks what it is that your clinic does, both in terms of how you work with students and then also the kinds of cases that you guys are doing.
Right. Well, so in terms of how we work with students, it's very much in the model that I think you and I came through in our clinic experience, which is of giving a tremendous amount of responsibility to the students. I mean, that's the philosophy, is that we want students to feel what it feels like to carry the weight of being a lawyer, going to counsel your client about the fact that she may be losing her relationship with her children. You are not the second chair. When you come to clinic, you are very much in the front seat. And so that's the model that I follow, which can be terrifying at times.
For you or for the
me?
students?
For everyone. For everyone. I'm sure for them and for me as well, because it's hard to turn over the reins. And because these cases move pretty slowly in my clinic, they are clients who I have worked with over longer periods of time than the students have. So our clients are all non-citizens, all residents of South Jersey, and we are representing them in their immigration cases. we have a mix of cases. Some of them are deportation defense cases, and some of them are affirmative cases where our clients are not necessarily in deportation proceedings, but are applying to try to get lawful status. And I think because of my interests previously in working with kids and also working with people with criminal convictions, I've tried to have cases that have some intersection with state law issues, family law, criminal law. And because the immigration court is in Newark, it can be challenging to do only deportation cases just because of the logistics. So that's one reason why I have a mix of cases. It is very satisfying in many ways, but one way is I think that there is very little free legal services in South Jersey for people in immigration matters at all, and particularly in deportation defense, because logistically it is challenging. So I'm happy that we are able in some very small way to fill that particular void. The other thing that we have started doing in the clinic since 2016 is we now have a contract, Rutgers Law School as a whole, with the Department of Children and Families in New Jersey to represent kids in foster care in their immigration matters. So that's a project that I do jointly with Professor Randy Mandelbaum in the Child Advocacy Clinic at Newark. And we now have 4 attorneys and a paralegal who are working on those cases for kids in custody. And so some of those cases I also take in my clinic that the students work on them as well.
So I want to talk about a bunch of things related to the clinic. So let me start with this. Where, other than the cases that you're getting that are coming from the Department of Children and Family Services, other than those cases, how do people find you?
Yeah, people are so desperate for representation, it's not hard. I mean, I do have a lot of clients who are referred by friends and family who we previously helped. And then nonprofits, including at the border. I mean, so people are social workers from Texas who worked with a child who then is moving to New Jersey will call me out of the blue, or another attorney who screened a kid and they know that that child is moving to New Jersey. I have pediatricians calling me to say they've worked with a family and they are non-citizens and I think it's incredibly difficult because we can take so few new cases because the cases last forever and the system moves so slowly that I am turning down clients on a very regular basis, and that's hard because you know that they may not find another lawyer. There's no right to free representation in immigration proceedings. So many people go without lawyers.
Right. And we sort of know, right, when people have to proceed pro se in any sort of legal proceeding, that it's kind of not the best set of circumstances. And I imagine in this setting that is particularly the case.
Yeah, I think the chance of success, I don't have it memorized by heart, but it's something like 5 times more likely, if you have a lawyer, that you will be successful in your case. And yeah, so it's when you turn someone down, you know that you're leaving them in a very difficult situation.
Right. Can you tell me, and maybe this is too difficult a question because you get such a range of cases, but can you tell me what a typical case would look like for you?
What we're seeing are a lot of clients from Central America, and they are coming both because of community violence, but we're also seeing a lot of family violence, domestic violence, and child abuse. And so some of our clients who are kids, will initially say, oh, I'm here for a better life, and they'll talk about education. But if you spend any amount of time really talking to them, they may tell you some very horrible stories about very painful things that happened to them. And we're also seeing quite a few LGBT youth from Central America who are coming here seeking safety because it's incredibly difficult to be out in many of the countries where they're coming from. But for our child welfare cases that we're getting through the foster care agency, I will say, though, that the kids are really from around the world. We do have a large number of kids from Central America, but we're seeing kids from everywhere: Africa, Asia, Europe, you name it.
And how do they get here?
Sometimes they're coming on tourist visas with their family, and then they end up in foster care the same way any child ends up in foster care.
Interesting.
Something happens.
Right.
So it's not the unaccompanied minor. It's very much an accompanied minor.
And that must be pretty tricky, too. I mean, if you're a parent who doesn't have legal status in the United States and your child ends up in foster care, that I can imagine that there are instances where people are afraid to participate in proceedings because they think that their immigration status will come out.
Yeah.
And sort of what happens to them then.
Yeah, but in most cases, what's amazing is, they do because they care about their kids first, right? But yes, it is terrifying, and it's any time that the government is involved in your life, right? It's terrifying, but especially when you are undocumented.
So you said that some of the young people who you work with have some really difficult stories about violence that they've experienced or family violence. And one of the things that I think is often very challenging in a clinical setting is helping students deal with, one, bridging the difference in some ways between themselves and the clients that you're representing, but also dealing with just the emotional side of, sitting across from a kid who's had terrible life experiences, and how do you, one, have those conversations with somebody, but also when you carry them home with you at night, how do you deal with that?
Right. I mean, we've been trying to do a better job of that. I mean, we're actually doing a combined class this semester. Professor Simpkins is bringing in an outside speaker, and all of the clinic students together are having a conversation with her about secondary trauma and burnout. So we are trying to help our students through that experience.
It's obviously something that lawyers who are doing this work have to deal with, but we want our students to be prepared for it too. So teaching a joint class with all the students who are in clinic, bringing in an outside consultant to sort of talk to them about how to handle it.
Right. Yeah. So
and to recognize it, right? That it's a real thing.
Yeah, and it's becoming more and more. I mean, I think if you talk to any immigration lawyer in 2019, they're going to tell you that it's very, very challenging emotionally. So we did that, or we're planning to do that this semester for all of the clinic students. Over the summer, we had a retreat for the staff who work on our foster care project, and we brought in 2 psychologists to talk to us about how to talk to our clients, and then also, a little bit about how to take care of ourselves. Out of that conversation was where I had the idea of trying to do some transformation of the clinic space to help us work with those clients, and trying to raise some money to make those rooms trauma informed, so that teaching the students what is the best way, the best environment also to have these hard conversations with clients who've experienced some really difficult things.
Right. And for people who haven't heard the phrase trauma informed before, what does that mean in this particular context?
Right. I mean, I think it means lawyering in a way that recognizes how you might want to lawyer differently for clients who have experienced trauma, recognizing the ways that survivors of trauma process information. They may have more difficulty in terms of conveying time sequences, understanding how the brain experiences trauma and how that might translate into how your client is sharing information with you, and how you can support your client and give them control as you are representing them.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the pieces, I've talked to some other folks in the podcast about this, one of the pieces of being a lawyer that I think a lot of people don't think about when they go to law school is how much of it is that sort of counseling role, right? And how much of it is or can be very emotional. Honestly, kind of no matter what kind of work you're doing. Right? If you're doing family law and people are getting divorced, right? That can be really hard to deal with. If you're doing bankruptcy law, if you're, trying to help somebody build a company, right? There's a lot that's going on for people there. And it requires that as lawyers that, we're not just people who are mechanically doing work for folks, but we are people who in some ways become really enmeshed in the lives of clients.
Right. I mean, no matter what the issue, they're coming to you at a time of profound stress in their lives. And I mean, honestly, that's one of the things that I love about being a lawyer is that for me, it marries the intellectual with the personal, the fact that you can do intellectually challenging work, look at statutes, look at cases, make arguments, but you also can work with people and support people and, get to know people. And so I mean, to me, it's the best of both worlds, but I think law school hasn't always been as good at working on that second aspect of being a lawyer.
Right. And it's harder to teach. You can teach somebody to interpret a case. You can teach somebody to read a statute. It's harder to say, what happens when your client breaks down when you're having a conversation?
Right.
How do you respond to that?
And it's interesting. I mean, students are it's helpful when they are self-aware, but I've had students say to me, I've been told I'm not empathetic. It's great if it comes naturally, but if it doesn't, it's at least trying to develop techniques to call on in those moments with your client.
Right. These are things that can be taught. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another piece of that sort of bridging the gap between students and clients, and I sort of said this a little bit, but I want to really preface it more, is that our students' experiences are often very different from what our clients' life experiences have been. And so part of what you're also trying to translate for them is you have to be able to or willing to understand why this person's choices, right, are shaped very differently than the choices that you've made. And how do you sort of deal with somebody who, is a person of color and you're not a person of color, somebody who's grown up in poverty and you didn't grow up in poverty, somebody who's, LGBT and you're not LGBT, right? And so how do you not project your expectations of how people are supposed to live onto the clients that you're working with?
Yeah, well, I feel fortunate that there are a lot of much more experienced teachers out there who have clinical professors who have kind of looked at these issues and written articles and done trainings and developed strategies for how to help students look at that. And I mean, one of the things, Sue Bryant at CUNY had this article about, and Jean Peters, the 5 habits of cross-cultural lawyering, and they talk about parallel universes and helping students kind of try to see those parallel universes that, they may look at a situation and think of it in a certain way, but for the client, maybe experiencing it in a completely different way. And, trying to at least ask the questions to help the students recognize the alternate ways that their clients may be experiencing, the same situation or sets of facts. It's tough, but I think the other thing I would say is I'm also amazed by our students in terms of how many students I've taught who have had some of these experiences and have had very profound experiences, similar to our clients, and students who have had close family members been deported or in deportation proceedings, or themselves are dealing with immigration issues. So I've seen and experienced both students who have very different backgrounds from our clients, and then some students who've had some similar backgrounds.
Which undoubtedly brings its own challenges as well. I want to talk about your child migration class.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that people are often very interested in travel classes.
Right.
And this I think is a pretty unique one.
Yes. I don't know of any other class like it. I mean, I think there are other classes where people travel to Central America, but not focused as we do on.
Well, tell people what it is.
Okay, yes. So our class is Child Migration and U.S. Immigration Law and Policy. And Professor Mandelbaum and I started the class in 2015 after, if you may recall, in the summer of 2014, I think that was the first time that the press really picked up on this large increase in the number of youth coming from Central America to the United States. And we were seeing it in our clinics. She runs a child advocacy clinic, I run an immigration clinic, and we wanted to understand what was going on in the countries that were sending a lot of these kids. And we wanted our students to understand, and we thought it would help us in our lawyering and just in our experience as U.S. citizens to know what was going on. So we at first had to figure out how we were going to do this, how we were going to create a class with an embedded travel component that involved us going to Central America. And early on, we focused on Guatemala, in part because we knew other folks who had gone there and had more ties there. There were parts that were also a little more stable than some of the other countries that we could have gone to. And we were just so lucky because one of our conversations was with someone who had done a Fulbright there, and she connected us with this nonprofit called Colectivo Vida Digna, which works with indigenous youth in Guatemala on both alternatives to migration and also helping kids who have traveled to the United States and been deported reintegrate into their communities in Guatemala. And through them, we actually learned about how much migration from Guatemala is a phenomenon of the indigenous communities and all of the historic reasons why that is. But they helped create a program for us where we are kind of embedded with the nonprofit, and we go to talks and we go to lectures. But I think what makes this really unique is that the kids in their program are with us for the week. So not only are we going to lectures and talks and going to sites and having fun, but we are also hanging out with kids who have migrated and come back or are exploring how they might be able to live their lives in Guatemala without having to travel. So we've had some amazing weeks. And each time I go, we've gone 3 times now, I think it can't be as good as it was the last time, both in terms of the experience and in terms of the group of students. Mm-hmm. And each time it has been amazing. So we started, as you know, alternating years of offering the course, mostly for our own sake, because it is a lot of work and a lot of time. But so this spring is an on year where we're offering it again.
And what's the classroom component like?
Yes. So we do have the classroom component both before and after the trip. We focus on understanding the law around child migration to the United States, what happens when kids are stopped at the border, what are the statutes and laws, regulations surrounding kids who come to the United States. But we also have had guest lecturers from the Latin American History Department who talk to us about the history. We've had child psychologists come and speak to us. There's a woman here in New Jersey who works with a town in Guatemala on economic development projects. So we do have a lot of guest speakers who come and help prepare. And then part of the trip is always the students doing some kind of Know Your Rights presentation. So last time we went, we visited the shelter where the kids go when they are deported from the United States. It's sort of the place where they land. And the staff there really wanted to understand what the kids were experiencing in the United States and the legal framework around that. And so the students did a presentation for them. We've also done presentations for the board members and the staff of the nonprofit that hosts us, so we can help answer their question, and help them also better understand the youth that they're working with, what's going on for them when they're in the United States. And then on the other side, when we come back, there's usually some classes where we try to debrief this experience on our own and with some guest speakers too.
Yeah. So I obviously cannot have a conversation in 2019 with somebody who does immigration law and not talk about where we are as a country when it comes to immigration. And I'm going to ask this in a very open-ended way and sort of give you an opportunity. You've been doing this work for a long time. You've seen sort of the shifts over the years, and I assume how quickly either changes in law or changes in how law is implemented have an impact on people on the ground. So where are we now?
I've never experienced anything like this. And this is from someone who I told you in my externship, I experienced the implementation of the last major immigration reform. And I mean, this is completely earth-shattering in a different way, and this is without a statutory change. And that's what's been so amazing, is to see the extent of what the executive branch can do. So things like reinterpreting definitions, it does seem like a lot of it has been targeted towards the client population that we work with in terms of kids. Redefining who is an unaccompanied minor. There's a lot of extra protections that come when you are an unaccompanied minor, and by taking away that designation, the kids lose a lot of protections, the right to have an interview before an asylum officer instead of in front of an immigration judge. So we've seen that happen, and things get implemented very fast. So over the summer, a change as of July 1 meant that we were scrambling to file asylum applications before this new deadline when our clients were no longer going to be able to have an interview before an asylum officer instead of a judge. Changes in the processing of cases, which cases are prioritized, I mean, from one day to the next. Even in planning my clinic docket for this semester, I was thinking, we're going to do these asylum cases because they're moving quickly, and so my students will get a chance to have an asylum interview this semester. Well, then the next week, we find out that Newark Asylum Office, they're sending their officers to the border to process people at the border, and they're not going to hear the asylum cases in New Jersey for a little while. It's been just a roller coaster, but I think the consistent theme has been limiting rights, limiting access to lawyers. I just had a meeting with a Third Circuit judge who organized a committee to look at immigration, expanding immigration representation in New Jersey. Well, that meeting, we used to have immigration judges at the table at that meeting. They're not allowed to come to the meeting anymore. They're not allowed to come to the meeting anymore to talk to lawyers who represent immigrants.
What do you think are the long-term consequences of what we're doing right now?
They're going to be profound. I mean, the numbers of people who are in limbo, just continues to expand. And we're losing people who could be contributing in more effective ways. One of the projects we also have at the law school is representing Rutgers students in their immigration matters. And we are now seeing college students who have been here for a long time, undocumented, and are not eligible for DACA, for the ability to work, because they were too young at the time it started. And so students who could be using their college degrees for good, who are stuck in limbo. And just the attitudes, the feeling of many people who no longer feel welcome, right, is going to last, I think, for a long time.
And no doubt that's the point.
Right.
I mean, part of these efforts is about discouraging people from crossing the border, discouraging people from staying here if they're already here, creating an environment in which people, as you said, not only don't feel welcome, but are actually living in fear.
Right. Yes. And I mean, it has worked. And the public charge, the recent changes around the public charge rule and limiting access to welfare benefits for some people, I think there's just a lot of confusion about that because there are people who it doesn't affect. The rule doesn't affect them, and they could and they're too afraid to go. And there's also a misperception that there are all these immigrants who are using welfare benefits. And in fact, it's incredibly limited, who can access benefits. Most people aren't eligible for, Medicaid or anything really, but perhaps their U.S. citizen children might be, and they're not going to seek support for those kids. So, I don't think it can be underestimated what the impact of these changes has been on the psyche and sense of community.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you one more question. What are some of the things that you wish people knew about our immigration system, right? You were sort of talking about this misconception that all of these, undocumented immigrants are on public benefits and that we should be scared of that. What do you wish people understood, both about how our immigration system works, but also about, the kind of people that you're working with in your clinic, the kind of people who are here potentially not having legal status, but who are here and have been here?
There are so many, so it's so hard to think about what is the one myth I'd like to break. I do think, one of the myths that kind of sits heavily on me is the notion of my parents came, or my family did it legally, and for everyone to just remember that there used to not be immigration restrictions. And so many of our predecessors, who came here there was no distinction between being legal and illegal or authorized. That just didn't exist. And this other notion that it's easy to get in line, or that there is a line, right? So first of all, there are huge numbers of people for whom there is absolutely no line. There is no path to lawful status. And then there are multiple lines, because for people who do have a path, there isn't one single line, right? There's all these different things based on what country you come from and what status you're seeking. And the waits can be 20 years. And one of the other notions I think people have is that, you can cross the border and have a child or get married and you're going to be able to legalize your status. And that's not the way the law works. There are serious impediments to that. And so I wish more people would actually take a class in immigration law and see
just regular people in the street.
Just regular people in the street, or just understand.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I'm thinking of this because we just did it in my first class in my clinic, was this exercise where you have descriptions of lots of different kinds of people, and the class has to individually and then collectively decide who we're going to prioritize for admission. And I think it really highlights the values that are underlying the immigration system, and why these discussions are so hard, and why reform is so hard, because these decisions are tied to deeply embedded values that are often in conflict. And it is for that reason that I am very concerned about the chances, to make change in the future,
right,
given where our system is. But I guess in the meantime, right, we will be fighting the best way we can, and at least giving the clients who we work with an opportunity for their day in court.
Yeah. I mean, I particularly like what you said about, this idea that our immigration system sort of works the same for everybody, right? Especially, we think about our, we had a Chinese Exclusion Act,
Right.
there have been all these sorts of ways in which that system has not
Right.
been fair, substantively fair, not only not procedurally fair. One more thing that I want to ask you about, I know I said that was going to be my last question, but one of the things I also want to ask you about is a lot of the discussion that we have about people being here who are undocumented, or who are here illegally, or who are out of status, is about folks who cross the border when they're not supposed to cross the border. It also, I've heard folks talk about the number of people who are here who are out of status because they overstayed a tourist visa,
yes.
right? I mean, we don't talk about
Right.
those people. Yet
Right.
that's a huge number of people as well. It doesn't seem like we're trying to round up everybody who's, stayed in New York an extra month.
Right. Well, I mean, they are now trying to figure out how to do that, and do better at tracking all of those peoples. But yes, there are a lot of people who are undocumented for that reason. So, and it's just interesting to me the way our system allocates blame, and the way we look at dreamers, and they're not at fault because their parents brought them, and maybe it's just because I'm someone who I don't feel comfortable assigning blame to other people, but that has always just struck me as something challenging to grapple with, and how ready we are sometimes as a country to kind of allocate, who is at fault for various things. When we had those discussions too in my clinic, when we talk about people with criminal convictions, who might have lawful status, and then they have some interaction with the criminal justice system.
Right.
But they may have served their time or done their probation, and sometimes the immigration consequences can be just vastly more severe than the consequences in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do here that I think is really fascinating is that we teach a class on crimmigration. So can you talk a little bit about what crimmigration is and what we do in that class?
Well, I mean, I do think so. I mean, this is going to be a little plug for the law school, because we do have this class that isn't offered at a lot of law schools on crimmigration, which is the intersection of criminal and immigration law. And we're lucky that we have a practitioner, an alum, Derek DeCosmo, who teaches that class and has a lot of on-the-ground, experience in this area, which I think is one that anyone who is working in the criminal justice system needs to understand how these systems interact,
So, for instance, what might seem like a good plea for a client, right? You're not going to do any jail time, but it's going to be on your record, might actually then put you into deportation proceedings.
Right, and not just deportation proceedings, but subject you to mandatory deportation with no opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge and explain why you should not be deported. And so you are doing your client a disservice, to say the least. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said that criminal defense lawyers have an obligation to advise their clients about the immigration consequences, in this case, Padilla versus Kentucky. But I think it's been a slow process of folks getting up to speed. And they're very, a lot of times if it's a private attorney, they're like, well, can we hire an immigration attorney? I don't want to deal with this. So I do think that, our students and grads who really know and understand these two systems have a very valuable skill. And one of the things that some advanced students are working on is updating this chart on the immigration consequences of New Jersey crimes, because many states, but by no means all, have these charts, and it's incredibly helpful to have a resource to at least jumpstart your analysis of figuring out what the consequences are. So that is something that our students will be contributing to the state. It is a big project, so it's still in the works.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. You know this, but obviously I think that our clinical program is foundational and important part of what we do as an institution, both in terms of teaching students, but also the literally hundreds of hours of free legal services that our clinicians and students provide to folks in South Jersey and across the state is really amazing. So thank you for being here, and thank you for doing what you do.
Well, and thank you for supporting the work in the clinic, and it was fun to hear a little bit about your own clinic experience in law school.
Awesome. Thanks, Joanne. The Power of Attorney is produced by Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations, minutes from Philadelphia and New York City, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more by visiting law.rutgers.edu.